Hi there. Welcome to Mushroom Hour. Today on the Mushroom Hour podcast, we are joined all the way from France by Stephanie Kilgast, artist, biological form, manipulator, creative, and mycophile. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us on the Mushroom Hour podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Let me say, first of all, that I'm a big fan of your art. For anybody listening, you can find Stephanie's work on Instagram under Petit Plat, which means I learned, small plate. So as we're talking, you can go check out the art to get a visual of what we're talking about. But, you know, my question for a lot of guests, and I'm really interested to hear from you, how did you start down this path? You know, what drew you into working with, you know, sculptural and visual arts? And then maybe a little bit of how nature became an overriding theme there.
Like I would say many professional artists, I've always more or less been an artist. So I've always been interested in creating things since as far as I can remember. So when I was really small, I started to draw, of course, but I got into modeling clay pretty fast. And I used to make miniature food for my dolls. And then I learned oil painting and then acrylic painting and whatnot. And later in life, I found my way back to sculpture, so to speak. And then I have the first phase where I would sculpt miniature food, hence the Petit Plat. And that lasted for a good 8 years. And in 2014, a friend of mine told me about the environmental impact of meat production, and I turned mostly vegan, but vegetarian really. And then so at that point, it was such a huge change in my life that I had to sort of talk about it in my work. And I did something specific in 2015 where I sculpted every day a different miniature fruit or vegetable that was edible. And I didn't do the whole year. I did 233 days, which was a lot. And after that, of course, I could not go back to miniature food. And I wanted, to talk about the impacts we have on environment and on the rest of nature. And so it took me a few years to kind of figure out how to talk about it. And until eventually I basically took trash and then I sculpted nature that was growing on top of it. And it's still kind of a theme in my work. So it's not necessarily trash, but it's always manufactured objects or sometimes in my paintings, buildings or bigger things, but always something that human made. And then nature is taking over. But there's always kind of a balance between the two. So it's not nature taking completely over or human taking completely over. Because ideally, if we want to keep living on Earth, we would need to find a balance between nature and us. I mean, we are part of nature, but what we do and the rest of nature. And so that's kind of the gist of it. And it's usually very colorful because in a way, the theme is really dark and depressing. I feel like I need colors for myself as well, and just like colors as well. So it's different things, but yeah, in a nutshell.
Well, I love the colors. First of all, a fantastic overview of your career. There's a lot in there, a lot of different arcs. But that was a great synopsis. But I will say that the themes come through very strongly. They're very striking, and it's always nice, or it's always gratifying when an artist talks about their work as a viewer to think, I picked that up, I got that. But yes, I noticed that theme
I'm super
coming
happy.
through.
It's like I managed.
Yeah, that's right. For the viewer, we definitely we registered that too. But yes, I mean, some of the work with the plastic, you got these kind of crumpled plastic bottle forms with beautiful like crystals and mushrooms growing out of it.
On a sort of milk cardboard thing, and
yes. So with bright colors, and I love the bright color palette that you use. It does kind of transition us from like thinking of like a post-apocalyptic or post-human world. And I noticed that with some, especially the building forms, they're not like decayed and ugly. It's like they're very much kind of beautiful building forms with nature growing out of it. And I think that was one of the drawings or paintings I was looking at. So I love how you play with what is a very potent theme for a lot of us, which is nature kind of reclaiming or kind of gradually getting its position back with anthropocentric culture. But you do it in a way that is approachable.
Well, thank you. Because it's sometimes, I mean, obviously now, not because I'm in a podcast and so, my ego is doing fine right now. But when you're an artist, there's a lot of doubt coming with it. And sometimes I wonder, like, what's the point of this? so it's kind of reassuring to So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, they're beautiful art and the message comes through now. Like I said, there are mushrooms featured in a lot of these pieces. Of course, that was how I got familiarized with your work. Almost forms that look like marasmius. But I'm curious when mushrooms kind of entered your work. Maybe they've been there from the start. Maybe you've always been kind of a mycophile. And then where you draw some inspiration for what mushrooms to use and why, and just some of that around the mycophilic aspects of the work.
I hope I'm not going to be disappointing, because for me it's really more visual than anything else. It's kind of sad to say, but I really got interested in nature as a whole, or biology as a whole, relatively recently, basically when I started working on it. So it's through my art that I picked up an interest in nature as a whole and natural history. And then I started reading about it, and then obviously got even more interested. And so now it's something that is a very big part of my life. And I'm very interested, even though I don't know all that much, but I try to read, and I also try to identify plants and birds and whatnot, all kinds of things, insects that I see around the town. And that is, it's a few years now, but it's recent in my life. So there are certain artists who actually were more biologists at heart and then became artists. And for me, it's really the other way around. I'm an artist at heart, and then I picked up an interest in biology. And now I'm really into it, but still through an artistic point of view. So I don't do work that is documentary or realistic or I love botanical illustration, for instance, but it's not something I want to do. I might do studies like that, but I'm not interested in that art form for myself. I am interested in seeing it first, yeah. And so this is how I arrived to, mushrooms is very specific in the sense that mushrooms, in sculpting, it's easier to sculpt mushrooms than flowers, for instance, because flowers have petal and it's very thin. And even nowadays, when I do flowers, usually I use paper. But now I'm much more mixed media. But when I started out doing different things, I would use just one type of modeling clay. And so I was kind of looking at things that were easy to sculpt. And so mushrooms were sort of, I don't know, it came quite naturally. So yeah, and then I'm kind of interested in, I don't have a preference. I like all shapes.
Yeah, you don't discriminate. You like all the different shapes of mushrooms.
Yeah, I was actually looking, because I got a cool book about mushrooms at thrift store local, and it's really dense and full of details, and I was really happy to find it. And I was looking, like trying to find, do you have a preference? I was like, not really. They all look great.
Well, and really that's the entry point for a lot of people's fascination with biology generally, but especially mushrooms. There are these beautiful things that you see in the woods. Mm. And then if you do get a reference book or a guidebook, you start to flip through and see things of colors and forms, and people don't even understand our mushrooms, jelly, fungi, and coral mushrooms. And so
yeah,
I think entering it,
I think, are fascinating, because but it's always the same, as you said, when you start taking an interest in nature as a whole, then you start looking differently around you. It's like now I cannot go out without seeing all the lichen and the moss and whatever plant is growing everywhere. And I remember I was visiting friends in Paris not so long ago, and I went to the botanical garden, because obviously, and there was
as you do,
So what's else to do in a city, right? and and so there was a coral fungus under a plant. I don't remember the plant, but I remember it was like, oh, so great. It's just
The
like,
plant has a big plaque, and you just see that little coral
yeah, it was like,
fungus.
oh, that's so amazing. This was really big. I'm not sure exactly which one it was because especially mushrooms, I find it really difficult to identify because a lot of mushrooms look very similar. But it was really big. It was almost like a sponge. And so I'm not actually sure it was absolute coral fungus, but it looked a bit like that, you know. So it might have been another. I'm not exactly certain, but I remember seeing it and was really excited.
Yeah, well, and the lesson's the same. Now that your eyes and your brain is keyed into finding mushrooms and fungi, that is what you're seeing. You're looking past the big showy plants and seeing these fungal organisms. And, you know, it's tough sometimes on an audio podcast to relay art, but what is your process of creating a mushroom? And the reason I ask this is I've gotten to speak with many sculptural artists who create mushrooms. And, you know, the process sometimes is like you make the stem by just rolling it in your hands. Or what's your process to make, you know, your basic mushroom when you started? What does that look like?
So right now, the mushrooms I do the most are with very thin stems and then a cap. And usually the cap is kind of, you know, the shapes are different. And so what I did is it took me a few days to make cap prototypes, and then I made a mold out of it. And so the stems, basically, I use wire. And so I wrap the wire in clay or wrap clay around the wire. And then I use those molds and I basically make mushrooms, and I make like 50 or so maybe at once. So it takes a while, and then I can paint them however I want. So right now I have like a cup of mushrooms that are just waiting for me to be painted. And then, yeah, so those are the mushrooms I do the most. And then there's one of the things I do a lot in my work, it's just basically tiny round balls that I put next to each other. And a lot of people think those are polyp inspired, and it works very well with coral reefs, so I don't mind. But originally, the inspiration were molds. So I do that a lot. And I like it because it's kind of a filler, so to speak. You know, it adds a lot of growth. And since it's so abstract and kind of neutral, it works everywhere. And I like that quite a lot.
Yes. It is a bioform. I mean, when you see those in your artwork, you know this is something biological and growing.
But you're not sure exactly what it is. It's like your brain, basically. When you see coral shapes next to them, then you're like, okay, those are polyps. But if you see mushrooms next to them, you're like, okay, that's maybe moss or maybe mold or maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, this is something biologically relevant. And it's interesting you bring up because coral and mushrooms, because I've always thought they're so related. And obviously visually and, you know, the imagery they conjure up is really similar. So I do love in a lot of your work, there is kind of that overlap between coral and mushrooms.
Yeah, I tend to mix those two together. And whenever there are mushrooms, you can see coral related things with it. Not necessarily the other way, because when I do really coral reefs, I don't really add mushrooms to them. It happens sometimes, but I haven't done that in a while. But yeah, the other way around, yes, because there are certain shapes that I just do every time in all the sculptures. So,
well, there was a really piece that I really liked where it was a crumpled plastic bottle. It had a split in the middle, and emerging from it were almost like anemones, I believe. They're kind of these, what do I want to say, these lithe forms that are around coral, sea anemones, and then emerging out of those were these thin-stemmed mushrooms as kind of these tall stalks.
Yes.
It was just a really interesting landscape
right.
when you blend that.
A lot, yeah. Those wiggly things. I have a friend of mine who calls them worms.
Because yeah, that's what they remind me. That's right.
And I make them
ocean
one by
worms.
one. I make them one by one. And basically I color the clay and then I make them one by one. And then I have a drawer with like all the colors in rainbow colors of these stems, so to speak.
Yeah.
anemones, and then I just use them and assemble them, and they go everywhere. So yes, they go with mushrooms or with corals. I don't care. They go everywhere. And I think I kind of like that level of almost abstraction where it's not actually a sea anemone in the sense that I'm not trying to make it really look like one, but the inspiration comes from there. Yes. And I think I like the repetition, of shapes as well. There's something, what I'm trying to do in my work is to represent an environment more than just a subject. So I want to have a lot of things going on rather than just have like one animal or something like that. Even though I do that sometimes. But
Yeah, and if things are too hyper realistic, it pulls, I don't know, for me, it pulls my brain into a different place than kind of analyzing an image as more of a symbol into analyzing it as an analog to the real organism. And it just puts me in a different space in my brain when I'm looking at a piece of art, when it's incredibly realistic versus if it's an abstraction that's clearly very alive and organic, but suddenly because it's not too real, I'm looking at it as a symbol, and I think I'm picking up more from it. Maybe that's just me, but
I think the problem with hyperrealism or hypersurrealism, or I'm not sure exactly how they call it nowadays, it's kind of too perfect. And so technically it's super impressive, and I follow a few artists who do that, and it's like wow. But at the same time, it's a bit boring, maybe. I know as an artist, for me, I'm sure they like doing it, but for me, doing hyperrealism, I can. It takes time, but I can. Like technically, it's possible, but I just get so bored by it, and it feels empty for me. Whereas when I, do it a bit more my way, I think it's more interesting. But sometimes it's difficult because hyperrealism is actually easier because you kind of just copy things. Right now in painting, I have to be kind of careful because I do need references to make it work. But I'm at that stage where I don't want to be too close, but it needs to, I don't know, I feel like it's another conversation, but yeah, it's a thing.
yeah, well, and I think this is certainly a bigger palette for your creativity when you get to play with colors. You're not bound necessarily by the real organism. And I was curious about that when you brought up references. If you go out into the field to find references, if you're caught sometimes when you're outside by some organism that you have to draw, or if it's mostly reference books or internet, combination of all of it, how do you draw some of those references? Because as much as we're talking about not sticking to hyperrealism, I mean, the forms you have are very much inspired by the real thing. So what is that process like?
A bit of everything. So I have way too many pictures on my phone because I mean it's good
Of
and
course.
it's good and it's bad, but since you have a relatively good camera in your pocket at all times, you tend to use it. And so I tend to take a lot of. I'm a bit able to kind of be like, you already have that planned like 1,000 times. You don't need it anymore. But I tend to take a lot of pictures because depending on the light and the season, the plant is different, the whatever. So it is interesting to have it. And sometimes I have a specific idea right now, and I want the picture of that plant now, and I don't want to have to go through the thousands of pictures to find. So certain times, I don't know, I would need a better system to deal with all those pictures, but I haven't found it, and yeah, I can't really be bothered with it. But yeah, I use a lot of my own pictures for work, and sometimes, no, not sometimes, almost every time I go out, there's something I kind of would want to paint or sculpt, but I rarely do it on the spot unless I'm traveling alone, then I might. Because honestly, it just takes too much time. If you want to draw something realistically, and I'm fairly fast, but you still need at least an hour to depict something well. Otherwise, it's just not going to be good. So when I travel, I might do that, but usually I rely on photos like most of us because it's just easier. And then I also have books. For one, because identification, even though I have an app on my phone, but that, and also for reference and for inspiration. because I feel like looking at a book is a bit nicer than looking at pictures on your phone. I tend to use phone reference more when I have a specific idea in mind, or when I see something and I want to identify it or something like that. But if I'm looking for ideas, I tend to go through my sketchbooks or through actual books. And sometimes I just need, because now I have a good idea of what are in my books. I have a fair few, but I still, I've seen them often enough, so I know, okay, I need butterflies, then get that insect book. I need mushrooms, then get that book. I need a reference for coral reefs because I'm doing always the same, and I need a bit of a refresher, then I have that book. So, it's a bit of everything, really. But I tend to really stick to references once in a while, because otherwise your work tends to get stale because you just repeat the same shapes over and over and over again. And I already do that, and it's fine. I try to, implement new things, because otherwise it's just the same stuff, which we don't want.
Yeah, that's right. I'm actually surprised to hear how much you do use your own reference photos because, with the internet and books, there's limitless biology that we could see and pick from. But that's almost too much choice sometimes. And just as a reminder, we're broadcasting here at 103.3 KPCA in Petaluma in Sonoma County. You're listening to the Mushroom Hour podcast with artist Stephanie Kilgast talking to us from France, talking about creating biologically inspired art, the messages contained there, and the practicum of how to gather inspiration. And really, when you're talking about that process, a lot of what you're talking about is also what I recommend to people who want to get into wild foraging. If people want to get into searching for wild mushrooms especially, or wild plants, I always say start with this kind of visual appreciation and research. Take tons of photos, try to identify things, because so many times when people reach out and they want to start looking for wild mushrooms, they say, oh, can I eat this? And, as many foragers know, that's not the first question you want to ask. You want to first just ask, what is this? And start this exploration. So has this spilled over at all into experimenting in any of the culinary arts, or, how does that relationship evolve, with some of this kind of foraging, and of course you're in France where that's a little more normalized here than in the US.
Yeah, so where I live, you don't forage a lot of mushrooms because I don't live in a very forest-rich place. I live very near the ocean, so foraging is more like mussels, maybe, and then algae, and then you have, I don't know how it's called in English, but it's something that is called salicorn, and they call it the sea green bean, the ocean green bean. I'm not sure how you would say that in English, but it tastes vaguely like green beans, very vaguely, and so you can
salty green bean, maybe.
I don't know. It's very salty and oceany. It's almost like an algae in taste. It's not an algae, so it's a plant, but still. So I feel like there's more ocean foraging here than anything else because, again, there are forests, but not like directly where I live. You have to go a bit further, and just the ocean side is more prevalent, I suppose. I wouldn't say that foraging is such a huge thing in France or Europe. It's a bit, but no, we buy food on food markets for the most part. So it's more like a fun thing that people do. Does that make sense? It's more like for leisure. If you have the time, then something to actually sustain from. Because food is not that expensive, I guess, and we have very agricultural land. So most of the food is just bought on food markets.
Well, and I didn't think that people were necessarily subsisting on it, but I know that there's a much deeper root.
If you go in Finland, because I have family in Finland, foraging is much more about sustaining yourself, I feel like. Maybe because the forest
that's right,
so much bigger, but whenever I visit my aunt, and it's not very often because, well, it's in Finland, so it's not close by, but mushrooms and good. Usually I go in summer, so you still have a few mushrooms, and you have blueberry season that is like crazy, and it's always like a thing. It's like, okay, let's go to the forest because she goes there every day, And then she also has a garden and she grows stuff. And I feel like that's much more about foraging and spending a lot of time outside and in the forest. Also, maybe because the weather is difficult in Finland, so winter is long and cold, and so when you finally can get out, you just want to go out all the time. So that might be it. But I feel like the culture is much more stronger there than what I can see in France.
That's a great point, is we do have true kind of foraging forward cultures in Scandinavia. I believe they have kind of their own version of the law of the forest. I forget what it's called now, but you can go on any property, even privately owned property, and forage for food. I just tend to think of Europe generally as having a little more roots in that than in the US. It's right now being sensationalized and kind of this big thing. And it's important. I think it's sometimes important for us to remember that there are a lot of other cultures where it's just, it's either part of the way of life or something that everyone's familiar with. But
yeah, I feel like that's true, though. Everyone's familiar with. I don't know anyone who hasn't done some foraging at some point. It's just not something you do all the time, basically. But then I have a Japanese friend, and she does it all the time. And she's the kind of person who, like, she sees a plant and she eats a bit just to see if it's edible. And I'm like, oh, maybe not always. But yeah, and she told me not so long ago, which I didn't know, that all algae edible. So that's really good because we have a lot of algae. And she was like, oh, I'm like, oh, that's great. And then obviously they're not all good in terms of taste, but you can eat them.
Well, there's a connection to another extremely mycophilic culture, which is like Japan and China and some of these countries that have literal, in Japan, I know there's a shrine to the gentleman that discovered how to cultivate a certain mushroom, a shiitake mushroom. They've got like temples. So yes, very myco-forward culture. It's always interesting to hear about. But yes, I think an entry point for people who aren't as familiar, maybe don't have a family or a culture that put them out in the woods foraging, one of the best places to start is the process you described of really going out, cataloging, trying to identify.
Or just enjoying, that's a great. Really.
Yes.
I mean, you don't have to forage to enjoy nature. I feel like it's just starting to look at nature around you, whatever is growing, even in cities. There are a lot of things growing in cities and people just don't see it. So I think it's just start looking at lichen and moss, and then you can go from there. People romanticize certain ways of living, like slow living. And I'm like, yes, that's great. But then you have reality, it's just like, it's not that, it's not that easy to start from nothing. And then suddenly you want to live off the grid and do just foraging. I mean, if some people do it, that's great. But I don't think it's something that is open to anyone, or not like, and I also don't think it's a life that really everyone would want to live. That makes sense. So I get often the romanticization of being an artist. It's the same. It's like, yes, I love my life, but it's also really difficult at times. And so people just see the good part, and it's true for most things. But I feel like foraging, especially these days, or nature, anything, is like kind of romanticized and like, oh, that pretty, the whole cottage core as well, oh, living from the farm. Yes. And then you're like, that's a shit ton of work. It's not easy. It's like one of the hardest jobs. Why are most people not farmers anymore? It's because it was really hard and they're really happy not to be farmers anymore. I mean, it's great if you want to. And I know people who got into permaculture and so who did studies and go back to it. But it's a different process than to just kind of imagine it as something fun and you have a few goats and.
Right. No, thank you for hitting us with a dose of reality. And that is so true. The way that we see things on social media, and you see a video and you're like, I'm going to live in the woods. I'm actually going to be a hobbit, and I'm going to get rid of my phone, and I'm going to live in the woods and just be with the plants. And then you realize, well, that isn't easy. No. There's a reason why we live this way. And, that was something we were talking about before the show previously, about social media and what that does to people's brains and how it shapes who we are both as viewers and people posting on it. Talk a little bit about that, your journey as someone who has, for me, a pretty big following on social media. You put a lot of your art out, but it's not a ton of, which I can relate to. It's not a ton of, you, and you're not like, here's my food and here's my family. It's really about the art, and you've kind of got to focus to it. But talk about that as an artist, having to deal with and get comfortable with social media.
Yeah, it used to be fun back in the days. When Instagram started, I don't remember what it was, maybe 2011, 2012, around that time. I don't recall exactly. It was really at the beginning. And you would simply, post your work. And that was it. You would do something, take a picture, post it, and that was about it. And then people would react to it. I don't know. That was something really easy. And then, of course, more and more people joined. And then, of course, it was sold to the evil of this world, which is Meta. And from then, everything just, slowly crumbled apart. And now it's kind of a disaster. And yeah, it's been a ride, because until a few years ago, I would grow basically as my profile would grow, I would gain followers. And I think it's been 2 years I've been steadily losing followers. And so you are really, it's good in a way, because it has forced us, every one of us, because I know I'm not the only artist who goes through that, but it has really forced us to dissociate with social media, because I feel like our value as artists and our perception of, is my artwork good or not, was very linked to the reactions we would get on social media. And now we really have learned that it's not so, and we have sort of, cut ourselves from that. But it gets depressing sometimes, because you feel like you've lost your voice. Yeah, I feel I have something to say with my work, so it's frustrating to see that the engagement is just not there anymore. Or sometimes it's there, but not, it's very random. So that's kind of frustrating. And it's also, what is frustrating is the systematical push of reels and short videos format. I don't want to see it. I don't want to do it. And yet I'm obligated to do them if I want my work to be seen. And so, yeah, it's been annoying, but what can you do? It's not my platform. It's not my website. So if I use it, I sort of have to follow it, I think it's terrible for humans, the short video format, but well, that's a bit of another topic, right? I think attention span is dramatically low these days, and people are just getting dumber and dumber, and it's kind of scary, to be honest. But
I think so many of us instinctively come to that place where we're kind of all realizing that, the social media, both the algorithms that kind of tailor what you're viewing, the way that it promotes certain formats, like that short, quick video where every 1 second you're cutting to some new thing and your brain can't keep up, prevents you from getting engaged and doing any kind of deep thinking in a way. But it did strike me that for artists in particular, you could say this for any business, but artists, especially who have a visual medium, the idea is you do have a message. You want it to be seen. That is the point of creating the work. It's to work on yourself and get ideas out into the world, but it's also to be seen and recognized. So
yes,
something that has so much potential. And again, you could extrapolate this to a lot of things, but it has so much potential. But and then it's so painful to see it grasp some of that, reach a little bit of that potential, introduce you to people that wouldn't have seen your work otherwise, and, give you inspiration from other people or ideas that you wouldn't have been exposed to. But then the way it kind of turns and it has all of these other negative effects. I don't want to say the wizard's dilemma. That was someone said recently, like these magical things that we don't realize how much they're hurting us. But it was interesting to hear a little bit of your struggle, because I've heard that from a lot of people where they've had something similar just the past couple of years.
I'm not alone in that. Luckily, at least. in a way, I feel like since we're all in the same boat, at least we're not taking it personally. It's like, oh yeah, well, I mean, it's just not working for us anymore. That's just how it is. I mean, you have like a few exceptions, but generally speaking, everyone has seen very low engagement, or yeah, it's been overly just difficult to get your work seen.
Well, and that's one of the dreams, right? Is you can kind of have your own platform as an artist. Again, you could say this for any kind of creative, but you have your own platform, you're promoting your work. It's a way to drive business and let you have the living doing the thing you love. So for you, if social media, you've had this kind of engagement issue, you're obviously having your own dissociated relationship with it. You're like, I don't like this. You called it the root of all evil, the company that owns it. So as an artist, then how do you keep moving forward with that as your vocation or your living? I mean, obviously the internet's still part of it, but what does that look like as much as you want to talk about? Because so many people, like you said, romanticize being an artist, but then it's kind of difficult to choose how to make that happen.
Yeah, I feel it's getting more difficult to be an artist now, or to start out now maybe, than 10 years ago, in the sense that there are many artists. That's one thing. There are a lot of humans on Earth. Doesn't
That's right.
help.
And we all have some creative capacity.
Yeah. So no, I mean, there's really a lot of artists, and sometimes it gets really overwhelming because there's a lot of qualitative art. So that's the third. But there are also a lot more collectors, so it should not be that much of a problem. But the issue is that most social media at the start, especially Instagram, it was, yes, you had people who would post daily life stuff, but you had a lot of artists using it to promote their art or just to show their art. And so it was a very art-rich platform. And now it's turned into an entertaining platform. And artists are not entertainers. I mean, visual artists. It's not what we wanted to do. I've never wanted, to be a fun, quirky, happy artist. I might be, but it's not what I want to share with the world. I'm not here to do jokes and do funny things and to do relatable
and dances.
I don't know. It's just like, it's not something I'm interested in. I don't want to see it, for once. I don't care about that. And I don't think me doing things that everyone else does just to get reach makes a lot of sense either. It's just like, I feel like a lot of artists nowadays that still get a lot of engagement, it's just following trends. Like right now, you have a lot of artists who do studies from the Ghibli studios. And I have nothing against the Ghibli movies. I like them myself. I have nothing technically against studies, but it's not art. It's just a study. It's just, we don't need 20,000 people who do the same cutesy landscapes and food and stuff. And you're like, but it's trending still right now and for a few years now. And so I think this is kind of a problem, because artists, instead of trying to voice their inner vision and feelings and the way they would do art without the internet, is lost because they're following trends and they're following things that work. And that is dramatic, because it makes art generally poorer than what it might have been or what it could have been. Following trends for an artist is just, for me, is like the worst thing you can do.
Well, and that was another question I wanted to ask, was about, and this gets right to it, about finding your voice as an artist, especially as a visual artist when there are more than ever. And the process you're talking about, where in order to get visibility in this landscape, you have to follow some of what other people are doing, whether that's drawing like Studio Ghibli or whatever it is, which would seem to make it tough to find your voice as an artist. Talk a little bit about that process, though, because you're someone who's had a couple different arcs and kind of how you've expressed and the arts you've created. So what is that like to find your voice as an artist, and what's that been like for you?
I feel like I'm lucky in a way because I'm older, and so I'm close to 40. So it's much easier for me in the sense that I grew up without social media and I grew up mostly without the internet. I got internet at home at around 15, and then it was like 1 hour a day max because it was so expensive, and we had AOL.
So your brain got to develop. That's good.
Yes,
without
but
the internet.
It's not just that. It's I got to experience art without the sharing aspect. You know, like nowadays it's my job, so sharing is not a problem because I mean I do it to sell it, or it's not the main point, but I do it so it gets seen and to sell it, so I want to share it.
Right.
But when you start out, and I see a lot of young artists, they might be really good, but they start sharing at the beginning of their journey. But at the beginning of your journey, your art is because you haven't yet developed the style, you don't know what you're doing, you're kind of all over the place. Maybe you're technically good or a bit more skilled because maybe you had the luck of growing up in a family that is more, art related. But the problem is a lot of young artists share right away, and so they're not actually ready. And everyone encourages you to share right away because we live in an oversharing world. But I think that's a huge mistake because you need the time to just do whatever you want and process it however you want. And then at some point you're going to find, a path or not. So yeah, in my situation, it's really easy because I didn't have to deal with that so much. And when I started to move the miniature food to the rest, I was already a grown adult, so it was a bit different. So even though it's like my painting, I'm like kind of all over the place, but I don't know, I don't care what people think. So it doesn't really affect me. I can share a lot of things, but I'm not going to look, oh, this is working, so I'm going in that direction. Because in the end, I need to like it myself to continue, whatever. But I feel like with many younger artists, it's harder because they're too young to know what's good or not. And they're also sometimes just too young to know what they like because it takes a lot of time to know what you prefer. It's not like I have a how to do it.
Right.
I feel like you need to be honest with yourself and to cut yourself from the internet. Even if you share online, you have to not look at others' artists' work. I personally find more inspiration in the real world than in other people's art. It's like when I visit museums of art nowadays, I like it and I find it enjoyable, but not as an inspiration. More like, oh, it's nice to see art. I don't really get inspired by it. I might get inspired with certain techniques, but that's very specific and I feel like that's very advanced. But I feel, especially when you start out, you really have to detach yourself from other artists' work to kind of have the time to just, experiment and see what you like and stuff like that.
Well, I think that's a really potent insight, is almost the privacy, the creative process being your own process that isn't shared with everyone. So you have a little more freedom to be creative and try things without worrying about, oh, what will people think of this? I mean, again, this is something we could apply to so many different disciplines my mind's thinking about, but especially for artistry, I mean, this idea that you get to hone your craft. And I love what you said about not looking at other people's work too much, because I find that even with something like podcasting or really any discipline like this is...
I mean, YouTube the same, video making and things like that.
Like you can get inspired by techniques, but ultimately theme and substance and some of these core things about what you want to present to the world, I mean, they need to come from the source material, right? Which is reality. It's like if
and
you're
yourself,
derivative off someone else.
And
from
world.
It within.
Yeah, it has to really come from within. And I think this is where honesty is really important. You have to be honest with yourself. Like, what am I interested in? Like, I am interested in nature. That's easy. But for instance, I have zero interest in portraitures or humans, depicting humans. I have no interest in that. But a lot of people do like to paint portraits. Then go for that, So you really have to be very honest about what you're interested in. It's like, and when you were saying, that, when you search the creative process and stuff, and the not sharing about it, originally you had sketchbooks for that. But with social media, what is happening? Everyone is sharing their sketchbooks. So sketchbooks have become an art form in themselves. I mean, it always has been, but especially nowadays. And so now it's just like art form in sketchbooks. You know, sketchbooks have become an art form, and you're like, yeah, but I mean, it's not a sketchbook anymore. That's not how a sketchbook is supposed to be. You know, you're supposed to, I don't know, do studies, doodle in it, write a few texts in it and there, you know. I feel like sometimes it can look good, sketchbook, I know, because I have sketchbooks, and sometimes I'm like, oh, that looks nice. But it's not the main purpose of it. It's just to kind of experience and have fun and try things out fast and quickly. It doesn't even have to be a sketchbook. It could be like on loose paper. But since everyone is always sharing everything, you don't, it's like not allowing yourself to make mistakes and to try new things out. So I think that's really a problem.
Well, and I think you've just laid out a really powerful insight that I'm excited to kind of mull over. And just to remind people that are listening on 103.3 KPCA in Petaluma, you're listening to the Mushroom Hour with artist Stephanie Kilgast, who just laid out a pretty big idea on us about keeping certain creative processes to yourself and allowing things to incubate and giving things time before sharing it out into the world. And I think this could apply to written works, music. There's always should be sketchbooks and recordings and things that you don't show to the world, so you can kind of hold this container of your own creativity to let it ferment and let it really do its work before you're ready to share it with the world. Well, we talked about some of your ideas with this mix of natural themes over top of like human refuse or human buildings, but with the message that you're trying to share, I guess, first of all, you know, tell us in your recent work, maybe a little bit of how that's showing up. And in sharing that message for you as an artist, does that make you feel a little more hopeful with some of this idea of how we're going to balance our relationship with nature?
I always dread that question. Because no, I'm not hopeful for the future. So I try to kind of, you know, there's I'm not sure there's the saying in English, but in France there's a saying like hope dies last, basically. And I think that's just inherent to human nature. Is like you keep fighting until it's just, you know, nothing is left. So in that regard, yes, there's still hope because, yeah, well, I'm still vegetarian and I still try to buy little. I know there's a lot of stuff behind me, but I try to not consume too much. I try to, you know, I'm really far from perfect. I'm not saying that I don't want to sound arrogant
but you're making
about
that
it.
conscious effort.
Yeah, I'm trying, but I'm like, there are much better models than I am, but I'm trying. And so if I'm trying, it means there's still, you know, tiny sliver of
That's
hope.
right.
But pragmatically, rationally, I'm not very hopeful about our future because I've been working on that topic for the last 10 years and nothing has gotten better. We live in systems that are very difficult to change, yet what we would need would be a systemic change. And I just don't see it happening. And I also would have no clue how to make it change. So in that regard, I think it's going to, I don't like to use the word collapse because it sounds dramatic, but I feel like the system is just going to, you know, run against a wall and then, you know, break, and we're going to have to do something else after that. Is it going to be worse? I'm not sure. I feel like it's going to be more local and, you know, smaller communities and more national, basically national sized or region sized or something like that. It's going to be harder on certain parts of the world because obviously with the climate change, it's already happening, but agriculture and food is a real topic. Water is a real topic. So yeah, it gets depressing fast. This is why I always dread that question because I've seen too many conferences about that topic to be very hopeful. It's going to be hard for the majority of people on Earth, and maybe not like I'm not too worried about myself because I live in a climate that has a bit of, I don't know, it's going to be all rightish, but it's already happening. in many places on Earth. And you just don't see it as much in Europe. Yes, we have a few days that are too hot in summer, but that's about it. I cannot say that in my personal life I, feel it much, but it's happening, and a lot of people have to leave their country because it's too hot. There's no food anymore. Water is an issue. Spain is really problematic in terms of water right now, and they produce food for all of Europe, but their groundwater is basically empty. They don't have any, they drank it all up. So that's a huge issue. I know in the US, California has a big problem with water as well. So yeah, it's not fun if you really start to dissect it, because the state right now is already bad and nothing is really put into place to make it better. And then we also have a mass extinction going on. So everything is dying around us, and it's because of us. So yeah, as I said, I was dreading that question. I know it always comes up, and it's difficult to tell you like, oh, it's going to be fine, because I don't think it's going to be fine. But in a way, maybe that's also a good reason to start doing something about it.
Stephanie, all these bright colors in your work, there has to be hope there. But and I totally appreciate what you're saying. And actually, one thing I like about your work is kind of these natural forms emerging. And something you said earlier about, we all have the capacity to take pictures of nature and appreciate nature, even if we don't turn into hobbits in the woods. And really, that's one big thing that gives me hope is I have a firm belief in kind of the generative capacities of humans. And even though it seems like something small and potentially unimportant, but getting more people out into nature, familiarized with nature, developing some kind of relationship, even if they're not leaving the world, the human-made world and industrial technology behind, and they're at least interfacing with nature, though, in their day-to-day life, I think that builds a will to protect it, interact with it, slowly be influenced by it as you take more of it into your life. And really, I don't think we can all separate from society and become hobbits, because that won't have the large scale kind of change that we would need.
No, and honestly, it's not going to be sustainable. Okay, to be fair, I think the most sustainable are small cities that are sort of auto-sufficient in terms of food. So basically, you have a small community that is not taking too much space, real estate on the ground, and then you have agriculture around it. Meat production takes a lot of real estate, yes, but to be perfectly honest, I don't think meat would be much of an issue if it would be cultivated differently. Like certain pieces of land, you cannot grow any food on there. In France, for instance, when you go to the mountains, you cannot grow food in the mountains, but you can have cows there. So it makes sense to have cows and to use their milk. I know there's a whole discussion about ethical animal rights and
humane,
and all of that. I understand, and I totally get it, because I wouldn't want to eat meat anymore. But as a society, I'm not sure it makes sense to completely be like, oh, let's go all vegan.
That's particularly relevant here. We have the same scenario, and actually we have some legislative battles going on with regulating and potentially over-regulating farms, whereas right now they're actually in these rock-filled hill spaces where they can have ranches and this economically viable kind of agriculture that is supplying local produce.
Yes.
And actually has a big role in keeping that land open and undeveloped.
And also it's providing food and energy and calories to eat. Do we overconsume meat right now? Yes, there's no discussion about that. We eat way too much meat as a society, especially since meat is then imported and you have a lot of deforestation going on. So it's like it's a problem globally. But I feel like there are certain ways of using land differently and using, but it's always like that. It's not black and white. It's a lot of grays.
And I think a big component of that is, like you're talking about, a localized system.
Yes.
And we have to think of these things as these kind of decentralized local systems. And there's this thing that happens when certain things get to a certain scale, you have all these negative externalities. So honestly, there is some hope, because people are having these ideas we are getting inspired by natural organisms, and we're finding new ways to partner with them and work with them. Again, this is something I see in your work. Like when you have those mushrooms growing out of a plastic bottle, I'm thinking of microspori. I'll remember the name of the fungal species that's able to decompose plastic very slowly right now. But we're also finding organisms, combinations of bacteria.
Larvae that eat polystyrene. I don't remember which larvae.
That's amazing.
But yeah, it's not enough to sustain them forever, but they can eat it for a while, basically.
But I think as we learn how to work with other organisms, this is kind of the original biotechnology, and we really turn back to technology that isn't metal or plastic, but is that natural organisms that we work with. I think there's a lot of hope there, and I hope that we can conscript our big industrial processes that kind of got us here to use these other techniques and what I want to say, like a fungus, take over those organizations and use them to kind of pursue this new path of biotechnology and regenerative futures.
I mean, there's also a lot of technology around mushrooms that is used in construction or, as faux leather and stuff like that. My boyfriend is an architect, and they actually worked on, with a colleague, they made a small structure for a competition using mushroom.
Yeah, mycelium.
Yeah, I think a portion of humanity is going to be able to adapt. And sadly, a lot of humans on Earth are not going to be able to adapt because, again, climate change is brutal in certain areas. And desertification is a real thing. And if you cannot grow food, you cannot do much.
Well, I am banking on all of the future brains of humans that are going to find solutions, but I totally get what you're saying. And I love that your work evokes these kind of conversations and these kind of thoughts, because it's really important to kind of wrestle with these ideas. And it does it in an approachable way, a fun way with these bright colors, even if the thoughts kind of lead us down a dark path. But Stephanie, please remind us, where can people find your work and find out more about you?
I have a website, which is stephaniekilgast.com. And then on social media, as you said, it's Petit Plat, but that's written petite with a T and plat, P-L-A-T.
I encourage everybody to go check out your work. To remind people on KPCA, you've been listening to 103.3 KPCA in Petaluma. You've been listening to the Mushroom Hour with our French artist and biophile, Stephanie Kilgast. And Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us on the Mushroom Hour. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.